Dmitry Nikolayevich, 35 years old, sits under the dim light of the interrogation room. The stark walls echo every sound, amplifying the silence between his words. His hands rest on the table, fidgeting slightly, a man searching for the right balance between truth and justification. Captured amidst the ruins of a once thriving Ukrainian village, Dmitry presents himself not as a villain, but as a soldier swept up in forces beyond his control. "I'm not the monster you think I am," Dmitry begins, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "I came here because I believed in something better. I wanted to fight for a just cause, a people's state, free from the corruption of Ukraine or the control of Russia." His words are deliberate, almost rehearsed, as though he's told this story many times before. But the man across the table, the interviewer, isn't buying it. With a sharp gaze, he interrupts. "A just cause? Tell me, Dmitry, what's just about driving families from their homes? About children forced to hide in basements while shells rain down?" Dmitry shifts uncomfortably. "I didn't see that," he insists. "I helped people, fed them, gave them shelter. I didn't harm anyone. I'm not one of those marauders." His voice falters on the last word, as if unsure whether even he believes it. The room falls silent for a moment, allowing the weight of the interviewer's words to settle. "And yet," the interviewer continues, his tone colder now, "you carried a rifle into a foreign land. You marched into homes that weren't yours. You stood with a battalion infamous for its crimes. Tell me, Dmitry, how do you reconcile that?" Dmitry leans back, visibly unsettled. I thought I was doing the right thing. Protecting people from chaos. From war." His eyes dart to the floor, avoiding the interviewer's piercing gaze. But the evidence is undeniable, and the narrative Dmitry clings to begins to unravel. The interviewer presses on. "Protecting people? Then explain this. Why were you in a village that burned the day you arrived? Why were its people forced to flee? Protecting them from what, Dmitry? Their own homes. Their lives before you came?" Dmitry opens his mouth to respond, but hesitates. The silence is damning. Outside this room, the world sees Dmitry as part of an occupying force, a cog in the machinery of an unjust war. But inside this room, he fights to reshape his image. He speaks of kindness, of sharing rations with villagers, of moments where he felt he made a difference. He recounts carrying supplies to families, giving water to frightened children. These are the moments Dmitry clings to, the actions he hopes will absolve him. But the interviewer isn't swayed. "And what about the homes looted by your comrades? The flags torn down, the families divided. You say you gave food. Did it occur to you that the food you offered came from the very people you displaced?" The words hang heavy in the air. Dmitry exhales deeply, his mask of composure slipping. He rubs his temples, visibly grappling with the weight of the accusations. "I didn't loot," he finally says, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't hurt anyone." "But you were there," the interviewer retorts. "You stood by while it happened. You were part of it. Your presence gave it legitimacy." How do you explain that? For the first time, Dmitry is speechless. His narrative of innocence clashes violently with the reality of his actions, and yet he clings to his story, perhaps more for himself than for anyone else. The interview ends its first chapter with an open question. Who is Dmitry Nikolayevich? Is he the misguided idealist he claims to be, or a willing participant in a campaign of destruction? The answers are buried in his words and the stories he refuses to tell. And as the camera lingers on his face, viewers are left wondering, what truths lie behind his carefully constructed facade? This is not just the story of Dmitry Nikolayevich. It is the story of choices, consequences, and the uncomfortable truths of war. Ahead, the layers of his fractured narrative will unravel, revealing a tale far more complex and far darker than Dmitry is willing to admit. Dmitry Nikolayevich was born and raised in Kislovodsk, a small town nestled in the Stavropol region of Russia. The air there carried the scent of mineral springs and the quiet hum of a community shaped by its Soviet past. Dmitry grew up in a household where stories of the Soviet Union's greatness were recounted like family folklore, tales that painted the collapse of the USSR not as history, but as tragedy. His parents, like many in the region, mourned the loss of the old order, often blaming the West for Russia's struggles. Television played an ever-present role in Dmitry's upbringing, and state-controlled channels were his window to the world. From an early age, he absorbed narratives of Russian exceptionalism, the rhetoric that painted the country as a bastion of moral superiority, constantly under siege by external enemies. In school, these themes were reinforced. Teachers framed history lessons with nostalgia for the Soviet era. portraying the 1990s as a time of betrayal and decline, and the West as a manipulative force eager to dismantle Russian power. Dmitry internalized these lessons, believing that Russia's strength lay not only in its military but in its unity, its unyielding ability to withstand outside pressures. By his teenage years, Dmitry's worldview was shaped less by personal experiences and more by the stories he was told. The news channels he watched every evening portrayed Ukraine as a fractured state, a place where extremists and foreign agents undermined its sovereignty. He began to see the world through this lens, a belief that Russia's actions, no matter how aggressive, were always defensive, a means of protecting its people and its allies. Dmitry's family was no different from others in their neighborhood. Conversations at dinner often revolved around the greatness of Russia's past and the perceived threats to its future. His father would speak of Western conspiracies with quiet conviction, while his mother nodded in agreement, adding that the world envied Russia's strength. For Dmitry, these beliefs became truths, woven into the fabric of his identity. Kislovodsk itself wasn't immune to the tensions of modern Russia. Dmitry watched as older generations clung to their memories of Soviet stability, while younger people like him faced an uncertain future. Jobs were scarce, and the promises of prosperity made by politicians seemed distant. It was in this environment, steeped in frustration and longing for purpose, that Dmitry's beliefs crystallized. By the time he reached adulthood, Dmitry saw himself as a defender of Russia's legacy, someone willing to stand against the chaos he believed was being forced upon his country by outsiders. It was this mindset that laid the foundation for his later decisions, guiding him toward choices he would come to justify as patriotic, even as they brought destruction to others. The world Dmitry knew in Kislovodsk was small, but the ideas he absorbed there shaped his perception of the larger world, a world where he saw himself as part of a righteous struggle, not as an invader, but as a protector. This conviction, born of propaganda and reinforced by the echoes of his community, would later fuel his journey into Ukraine, where the reality of his actions would stand in stark contrast to the ideals he claimed to uphold. Dmitry Nikolayevich's decision to join the war wasn't made in a single moment. It was a culmination of years of simmering discontent, a search for purpose, and a steady diet of propaganda that painted the conflict as a noble cause. When he first heard about the fighting in Ukraine, Dmitry, like many others in his small town, saw it through the lens of the state-controlled media. The narrative was clear. Ukraine was a broken state, overrun by extremists and manipulated by Western powers, and it was Russia's moral duty to protect the people in the Donbass region. The idea of a people state, independent and free from the corruption of both Kyiv and Moscow, was appealing to Dmitry. It felt righteous, a cause worth fighting for. But beneath this idealism lay other motivations, ones Dmitry rarely acknowledged, even to himself. Life in Kislovodsk had not been easy. Job opportunities were scarce, and the promise of stability seemed perpetually out of reach. Joining the war offered not only a sense of purpose, but also practical benefits. Soldiers in the separatist battalions were promised steady pay, housing, and even land, incentives that were hard to ignore for a man like Dmitry, struggling to make ends meet. Dmitry began to rationalize the decision as both patriotic and pragmatic. He convinced himself that fighting for the people's state wasn't just about defending Russian-speaking communities. It was about creating a better future, not just for the people in the Donbass, but for himself as well. He told his family he was answering a higher call, that he couldn't sit idly by while his compatriots faced oppression. But his mother's response was one of quiet despair. She had seen the news reports, the funerals of local boys draped in Russian flags. She begged him not to go, to stay home and find another way to support their family. Dmitry, however, had already made up his mind. He assured her it was only temporary, that he would return soon, and that his involvement was for the greater good. Still, deep down, Dmitry knew there was more to his decision than he admitted. The war wasn't just a noble cause, it was an escape from a life that felt stagnant, a chance to be part of something bigger than himself. The recruiters who came to town only reinforced this sense of urgency. They spoke of camaraderie, of fighting for the oppressed, and of restoring dignity to the Russian-speaking people. Dmitry, eager to believe, signed up without hesitation. But once in uniform, the ideals of a people's state quickly gave way to the realities of war. The camaraderie he had imagined was replaced by the cold efficiency of a military machine. Orders came from above, and dissent was not tolerated. Dmitry found himself among men with varying motivations, some driven by ideology, others by greed or desperation. The lofty vision of a liberated people began to blur under the weight of looted homes, displaced families, and the cries of those caught in the crossfire. And yet, Dmitry held on to his belief in the cause, even as it became harder to justify. He told himself he was doing what needed to be done, that the ends justified the means. But as time went on, the line between protector and occupier became harder to distinguish. Dmitry's decision to join the war was rooted in both idealism and opportunism. He saw himself as a hero of a righteous struggle, a man answering history's call. But the truth was far messier, a mixture of hope, desperation, and self-deception that would haunt him long after he crossed the border into Ukraine. Dmitry Nikolayevich's voice remains steady as he recounts his version of the story, a tale of duty, camaraderie, and a mission to protect the vulnerable. He insists he joined the war to defend the people of the Donbass, to shield them from a government he calls oppressive. The people's state he envisioned, Dmitry says, was his guiding light. But as the interviewer begins to challenge his narrative, cracks in the story quickly begin to show. Dmitry claims he only carried out defensive actions, focusing on humanitarian efforts rather than combat. Yet, the interviewer doesn't let these assertions go unexamined. You speak of defense. The interviewer interjects, but we have records of your unit's movements. You crossed into Ukrainian territory, occupied villages, and set up checkpoints. Defensive actions don't involve displacing civilians or confiscating their homes. Dmitry stumbles slightly, but recovers with a practiced response. We were securing the area, he says, trying to protect the locals. They were afraid of Kiev's forces. We were there to help. The interviewer, unimpressed, presses further. Help? There are reports from the villages you entered. Families forced to leave under threat. Homes ransacked. And the children you claim to protect. What about their fathers? What about the men who were taken away and never seen again? Dmitry shifts uncomfortably, his gaze darting to the side. I didn't know about that, he says quietly. I wasn't involved in any of that. I just followed orders. The interviewer leans in, their tone sharpening. Following orders doesn't absolve you, Dmitry. You were there. You were part of it. Were you blind to what your comrades were doing? Dmitry's face hardens as he tries to maintain his narrative. He pivots, describing moments of kindness, offering food to scared villagers, calming crying children. I didn't harm anyone, he insists. I did what I could to help. But the interviewer's next question cuts through his defenses. Did you ever ask yourself where that food came from? Did you ever wonder if it was stolen from the same families you were supposedly protecting? Dmitry pauses, the weight of the question pressing down on him. I didn't think about it, he admits, his voice barely above a whisper. The interviewer doesn't let up. And what about the looting? The burned homes? The prisoners your battalion took? You talk about protection. But what about the destruction left in your wake? Dmitry struggles to respond, his narrative unraveling with every pointed question. The ideals he clings to, of defense, of justice, are laid bare as fragile justifications for actions that caused pain and suffering. The interviewer continues, now drawing on direct accounts from survivors. One woman remembers your battalion arriving. The interviewer says, her voice breaking as she describes how her husband was dragged away. Do you remember her, Dmitry? Were you protecting her? Dmitry looks down at his hands, his composure slipping. I didn't. I don't know her, he murmurs, but the conviction in his voice is gone. The contradictions between Dmitry's version of events and the interviewer's revelations paint a stark picture. He wants to believe he was a protector, a soldier fighting for a cause. But the reality is more damning. The people he claims to have helped saw him and his comrades as occupiers, as agents of chaos. Dmitry's narrative, carefully constructed and repeated like a mantra, begins to crumble under the weight of the truth. What remains is not a hero's story, but the fragmented reality of a man grappling with the consequences of his choices. Choices that, whether he admits it or not, left deep scars on the lives of others. Dmitry Nikolayevich paints himself as a reluctant hero, a man swept into a conflict he neither fully understood nor completely agreed with, but who nonetheless tried to do the right thing. He recounts moments where he believes he made a difference, small acts of kindness that, to him, define his role in the war. I remember a family hiding in a basement. Dmitry begins, his voice softening, as if to lend sincerity to his words. A mother and her 2 children, terrified. They had no food, no water. I shared my rations with them. The boy couldn't have been older than 8. I gave him my jacket to keep warm. His eyes search the interviewer for a reaction, a glimmer of approval, but the response is cold and unyielding. And yet, the interviewer says, that same family says they fled their home shortly after your unit arrived. They described soldiers smashing doors, taking what they wanted. Dmitry stiffens, his expression guarded. I didn't see that, he replies defensively. I wasn't part of it. The interviewer presses on, their voice sharper now. You talk about protecting children, Dmitry, but what about the reports of families separated? Fathers taken away under suspicion, never to return. Homes burned as warnings. Were those the actions of a protector? Dmitry looks down, his hands clasping tightly together. I didn't have control over what others did, he says quietly. I focused on helping where I could. The interviewer doesn't relent. Helping? There's testimony from another village or battalion entered. A teenage girl remembers soldiers raiding their home, taking her father. She said they told him he was collaborating with the enemy. He never came back. Her little brother cries every night, asking where his papa is. Did you help them too? Dmitry's face hardens, his composure cracking. I didn't take anyone, he snaps, his voice rising defensively. I wasn't involved in any of that. I was there to protect, not to hurt. But the interviewer's tone remains steady, unwavering. Your battalion has a reputation, Dmitry. The Prize Rack Battalion isn't known for its charity. Villages remember its arrival as the start of their suffering. You say you helped, but the evidence paints a different picture. Looted homes, displaced families, entire communities left in ruins. Were you blind to all of it? Dmitry swallows hard, his voice faltering. I didn't see everything, he says weakly. I tried to stay out of it. The interviewer leans forward, their voice cold and deliberate. Staying out of it doesn't absolve you. You were there. You carried a rifle. You stood alongside the men who terrorized those families. You were part of it, whether you want to admit it or not. Dmitry falls silent, the weight of the interviewer's words pressing down on him, the hero he tries to present, the man who shared rations, who shielded children from harm, clashes violently with the reality of his actions, or at the very least, his complicity. The more he speaks, the more his contradictions emerge. For every tale of kindness Dmitry recounts, the interviewer counters with accounts of cruelty, injustice, and destruction. Each story Dmitry offers as evidence of his goodness becomes a fragile defense against a mountain of damning evidence. In his mind, Dmitry may see himself as a protector, a man who did his best in impossible circumstances. But to those who lived through the occupation, he is not a hero. He is one of the many faces of a force that brought fear, suffering, and loss. As the interrogation continues, it becomes clear that Dmitry's narrative is not just an attempt to justify his actions, but a desperate effort to reconcile the man he wants to be with, the man he has become. The interviewer doesn't waste time dissecting Dmitry Nikolayevich's claims of innocence, zeroing in on the inconsistencies that underpin his story. Dmitry's words, carefully chosen and repeatedly rehearsed, crumble under the weight of facts and first-hand accounts. You speak of protecting people, the interviewer begins, their tone measured but firm. But your beliefs, Dmitry, were built on lies. Lies you chose to believe because they were easier than questioning your orders. Dmitry's eyes flicker with defensiveness. What lies? I saw it myself. The people in Donbass were begging for our help. Ukraine abandoned them. It was chaos before we came. The interviewer pauses for a moment, then leans in slightly, their voice sharper now. Chaos? Or is that what you were told to see? Your media painted Ukraine as a failed state, overrun by extremists. Did you ever think to ask yourself why those images were all you saw? Dmitry shifts uncomfortably but doesn't respond. The interviewer continues, cutting through the silence. Propaganda, Dmitry. That's what shaped your view of this war. Not justice. You were fed stories of Nazis and corrupt leaders, of a people desperate for Russian protection. And yet, when you arrived, what did you see? Did those families welcome you, or did they hide in fear? Dmitry clenches his jaw, his voice tense. They needed us, he says, but the conviction in his tone is fading. We were there to stabilize things, to keep them safe. The interviewer doesn't let up. Keep them safe? From what? You marched into their villages with rifles and tanks, your battalion looting their homes, tearing apart their lives. That's not safety, Dmitry. That's war. Dmitry's expression falters, but he presses on, clinging to his version of events. We were following orders. I didn't see the things you're describing. I just did what I was told. The interviewer's voice grows colder, more precise. And what you were told led to war crimes. People detained without cause, families separated, civilians caught in the crossfire. Do you remember the boy in Novomykolaievka, 15 years old? beaten because your unit thought he was spying. The villagers say he was just a child trying to find food. Dmitry flinches slightly, his hands tightening into fists. I didn't know about that, he mutters, his voice barely audible. I wasn't involved in those decisions. The interviewer's eyes narrow. But you were there. Your presence legitimized it. You carried the rifle. You guarded the roads. You stood by while it happened. Do you think your silence made you innocent? Dmitry exhales sharply, his composure slipping further. I didn't hurt anyone, he says defensively. I wasn't one of the ones doing those things. But the interviewer doesn't let him off the hook. Your battalion was notorious for what it did. Looting, detentions, homes burned as warnings. You may not have lit the matches, Dmitry, but you were there, and you did nothing to stop it. The propaganda you believed told you this was a just war, but you've seen the truth now. The interviewer lets the silence settle, the weight of their words hanging in the air. Dmitry's face is pale, his eyes avoiding contact. For every justification he offers, the interviewer counters with evidence of the war's brutal reality. Propaganda may have brought Dmitry to the battlefield, but it was his actions, or lack of resistance, that tethered him to the atrocities committed. The truth, stark and undeniable, looms over him. The man he wants to be is overshadowed by the choices he made and the system he chose to serve. Dmitry Nikolayevich sits rigid, his defenses slowly eroding under the weight of the conversation. His words, once rehearsed and confident, now falter as the cracks in his reasoning grow more apparent. I didn't come here to hurt anyone, Dmitry insists, his voice trembling with frustration. I believed in what we were doing and helping people who couldn't help themselves. He looks up, searching the interviewer's face for understanding, but finds none. The interviewer waits for a moment, then responds calmly, almost coldly. You believed in helping people, Dmitry, but you carried a rifle into their homes. You stood by as those same people were forced to flee. How do you reconcile that? Dmitry's breath catches for a moment, but he pushes forward, clinging to the fragments of his justification. I wasn't the one making those decisions. I didn't loot homes. I didn't threaten anyone. I followed my orders, that's all. And do you think following orders absolves you? The interviewer's question is sharp, cutting through Dmitry's argument. What about the families whose lives were torn apart? The people who saw their homes burned? Did you ever ask yourself if the orders were wrong? Dmitry shifts uncomfortably, his hands gripping the edge of the table. I didn't have a choice, he mutters. If I didn't follow orders, what would have happened to me? The interviewer leans forward slightly, their voice steady but unrelenting. And what happened to the people you were following orders against? You talk about not having a choice, but did they? Did the families in those villages choose to leave their homes? Did the fathers your unit detained choose to vanish? Dmitry's face tightens, the moral conflict etched across his features. I didn't want any of that, he says, almost pleading. I didn't know it would be like this, I thought. He trails off, the words hanging in the air. The interviewer doesn't let him escape the silence. You thought what, Dmitry? That you could walk into a war zone, a foreign country, and somehow make it better by pointing a gun at its people? Dmitry exhales sharply, his frustration spilling over. I believed in the cause, in the idea of helping those people. I didn't want this war to be about destruction. But it wasn't my decision. The interviewer's response is measured but unwavering. You believed in the cause, but the cause didn't believe in you. It used you, Dmitry. You thought you were helping, but you became a tool for something much darker. Every time you stood by and did nothing, every time you followed those orders, you made a choice. Dmitry's voice rises slightly, defensive now. What was I supposed to do? Go against my own unit? Get myself killed? The interviewer counters immediately. And what about the people who were killed because of your unit? The ones who had no unit to protect them, no orders to shield them? You talk about survival, but their survival didn't matter to you, did it? Dmitry looks away, his face pale and strained. His logic, once a fortress of self-preservation, now lies in ruins under the pressure of the interviewer's questions. Every argument he makes to defend himself circles back to the same place. His actions, no matter how he frames them, contributed to the suffering of others. And the more he tries to explain, the more he exposes the emotional and logical gaps in his reasoning. Dmitry clings to his belief in the cause, but it's clear he's grappling with the consequences of his choices. His justifications, of following orders, of not having a choice, ring hollow against the backdrop of the war's realities. Beneath his defiance lies a man wrestling with guilt, a man whose vision of himself as a protector is slowly crumbling under the weight of the truth. The moral conflict is written across his face, in the tremble of his voice, and the silence that follows each question he can't answer. For Dmitry, there is no resolution, only the growing realization that the ideals he fought for were a facade, and the man he thought he was never truly existed. Dmitry Nikolayevich's involvement with the infamous Prize Rack Battalion is a shadow that looms over his narrative. Known for its aggressive tactics and reputation for sowing chaos, the battalion operated in the contested areas of Donbass, leaving fear and destruction in its wake. Dmitry initially describes his role as logistical, guarding checkpoints, securing supply lines, and maintaining order. "I wasn't on the front lines," he insists, his tone defensive. "I didn't storm houses or lead raids. I was there to support the unit to make sure the mission could continue." But the interviewer doesn't let him stop there. "The Prize Rack Battalion doesn't just guard checkpoints, Dmitry. They state with icy precision. Your unit had a reputation." "What about the raids in Krasny Lyman?" Dmitry's eyes flicker with unease, but he doesn't look away. "I wasn't part of that," he replies quickly. Almost too quickly. "I stayed back at the command post. That wasn't my responsibility." The interviewer counters immediately, their tone laced with skepticism. "But you were there when it happened." Testimonies from survivors describe the unit taking men from their homes, claiming they were collaborators. Entire families were uprooted overnight. And let's not forget the looting, Dmitry. Radios, tools, even children's toys. Items your battalion didn't need for survival. Dmitry hesitates, his lips pressed into a thin line. "I didn't take anything," he says quietly. "I don't know what others did. I tried to focus on my duties." The interviewer leans forward, their voice cutting deeper. "And your duties included standing guard while others carried out these actions, didn't they? You may not have taken anything, Dmitry, but you were there. Your presence enabled them." Dmitry swallows hard, the tension in his posture betraying his discomfort. There was one moment he cannot deny, an event etched into the memories of both the villagers and his comrades. It was in Svitlodarsk. He begins reluctantly, his voice low. "We were told to secure a perimeter. It was late, dark, and the air was heavy with tension." Dmitry pauses, his gaze fixed on the table. He exhales sharply before continuing. "Some of the guys went into a house. I stayed outside. I could hear shouting, glass breaking. I don't know what happened inside." The interviewer's response is swift. "But you didn't stop them, Dmitry. You didn't question what they were doing, did you?" Dmitry's face hardens, but his voice falters. "I didn't have the authority to question them. I wasn't in charge." The interviewer presses further, their tone now unforgiving. "Authority doesn't excuse silence. You stood there while people were terrorized in their own homes. You didn't pull the trigger, but you didn't stop the ones who did." Dmitry sits back, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the accusation. He recounts another instance, this time at a checkpoint near Debaltsevo. "We stopped a car," he says, his voice devoid of emotion. "Two men, both locals. They had papers, but the commander said they looked suspicious. They were taken away. I never saw them again." The interviewer seizes the moment. "And you didn't ask why? You didn't demand answers?" Dmitry shakes his head, his voice barely audible. "It wasn't my place. I didn't want trouble." The interviewer's response is sharp, their words cutting through Dmitry's feeble justifications. "And what about the trouble you caused for those men? For their families?" Dmitry falls silent, the stories he tells only adding to the weight of his complicity. Every event he describes reveals his passive role in the battalion's actions. Standing guard, watching, allowing the injustices to unfold. While Dmitry clings to the belief that he wasn't directly involved, the reality is clear. His presence, his silence, and his compliance made him an enabler of the atrocities carried out by the Prize Rack Battalion. The hero he wants to portray himself as becomes harder to see with each word he speaks, each event he recalls. Dmitry's attempts to distance himself from the battalion's reputation only serve to entangle him further, exposing the harsh truth of his role in the destruction left behind. The interviewer's questions shift focus, drawing attention to the stories of those who lived through Dmitry Nikolayevich's presence, the civilians who bore the brunt of the Prize Rack Battalion's actions. These testimonies, raw and vivid, serve as stark counterpoints to Dmitry's attempts to defend himself. "They saw you not as a protector, Dmitry, but as an invader." The interviewer begins, their tone steady but cutting. "Let me tell you about the Komenko family from Svitlodarsk. The father, Andrei, was a school teacher. When your battalion came, his family tried to stay out of the way, but one night, soldiers entered their home. They took Andrei, accused him of collaborating with Ukrainian forces. His wife begged them not to take him. She held their daughter, barely 6 years old, as she cried, pleading for her papa to stay." Dmitry shifts in his seat, his jaw tightening. I didn't take him, he says quickly, his voice defensive. I don't even know who that was. The interviewer continues, unrelenting. But you were there, continues, unrelenting. But you were there. Dmitry, Andrew's wife said she saw your battalion in setup. She remembers the trucks parked outside, the checkpoints your men set up. Her husband never came back. Did you ever wonder what happened to men like Andrew? Dmitry looks away, his silence speaking louder than any words. Another story follows, this time from a woman in Krasny Lyman. Alha, a grandmother who lived alone, describes soldiers storming her home, claiming they were searching for weapons. They smashed furniture, emptied cupboards, and took what little food she had. She says one of the soldiers handed her a can of soup afterward, as if that made up for the destruction. Was that you, Dmitry? Did you hand out food to someone whose home your comrades had just destroyed? Dmitry exhales sharply, his frustration visible. I wasn't in that house, he says firmly. I didn't loot anything. But the interviewer's voice doesn't soften. And what about the fact that you stood by while it happened? Did you think the food you handed out came from nowhere? These people watched their homes torn apart by the men you marched with. Do you think a can of soup erases that? Dmitry leans forward, his voice rising slightly. I didn't want any of this to happen. I didn't know everything that was going on. I did what I could to help. But the interviewer cuts through his defense. Helping? Let me tell you about Mykola, a boy from Debaltsev. He was 12 when your unit set up camp near his village. He remembers soldiers taking his father, accusing him of spying. He says he ran after the trucks, screaming for them to let his father go. He says the soldier pushed him down, told him to go home. Was that helping, Dmitry? Was that protecting? Dmitry's shoulders slump, his voice dropping to a whisper. I didn't know about the boy. I wasn't there. I didn't push anyone. But the stories keep coming, each one peeling back another layer of Dmitry's narrative. The villagers who fled with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The farmers whose fields were turned into battlegrounds. The mothers who buried their children after shells fell too close. These aren't abstract tales. They are the lived realities of people who crossed paths with Dmitry's battalion. The interviewer presses further, their voice laced with quiet intensity. These people remember you, Dmitry. Maybe not your name, but your uniform, your rifle, your silence. You want to believe you were helping, but all they remember is fear. Fear of what you and your comrades would do next. Dmitry's eyes glisten, his composure cracking. I didn't want any of this, he murmurs, his voice barely audible. But the words feel hollow, swallowed by the weight of the testimonies that hang in the air. The stories of the captured civilians and survivors reflect not just the consequences of Dmitry's actions, but the inescapable reality of his complicity. No matter how hard he tries to distance himself, their memories tether him to the destruction, the pain, and the lives left in ruins. Dmitry's silence in the face of these stories speaks volumes. His attempts to justify himself are drowned out by the voices of those who suffered, their truths shining a harsh light on the man he wants so desperately to separate himself from. Dmitry Nikolayevich sits motionless, the interviewer's words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. The stories of those who lived through the actions of his battalion, the lives disrupted or destroyed, weigh on him visibly. His once defensive posture has collapsed into something smaller, almost fragile. His hands, now clasped tightly together, betray the strain of holding himself together. I didn't want to be a part of this, Dmitry says quietly, his voice stripped of its earlier conviction. I thought I was doing the right thing, but... He trails off, as if even he isn't sure what to believe anymore. The interviewer leans in, their voice softer now, but no less cutting. But you were a part of it, Dmitry. You made choices, even if they were choices to stay silent, to follow orders, to ignore what you saw. Those choices have consequences, for the people whose lives were shattered, and for you. Dmitry exhales shakily, his gaze fixed on the table. I've been trying not to think about it, he admits, his voice raw. But it's there, in my head. Faces I can't forget. The boy running after the truck. The old woman crying as her house was destroyed. I see them, at night, when I try to sleep. The interviewer presses gently, peeling back the layers of Dmitry's psyche. And what do you feel when you see them, Dmitry? Regret? Guilt? Anger? Dmitry's brow furrows, his expression clouded with conflict. I don't know, he says after a long pause. I tell myself it wasn't my fault, that I was just following orders, that I didn't have a choice. But Dmitry looks up, his eyes meeting the interviewer's for the first time in what feels like hours. But it doesn't feel like enough. It doesn't make it go away. The interviewer lets the silence stretch, allowing Dmitry to wrestle with his thoughts. You talk about not having a choice, they say finally. But every day you chose not to speak up, not to resist, not to leave. Those choices may have been easier, safer, but they were still choices. Dmitry flinches slightly, his shoulders slumping further. I didn't want to die, he says defensively. If I had refused, if I'd said anything, they would have killed me. The interviewer nods slowly, acknowledging his fear. Maybe, they reply. But what about the people who had no chance to choose? The ones who had no weapons, no battalion, no orders to follow? Did they deserve what happened to them, Dmitry? Dmitry's face twists, his expression a mixture of anger and despair. No, of course not, he says sharply. But I didn't know how to stop it. I was just trying to survive. And how are you surviving now? The interviewer asks, their voice softening further. Do you feel like you're still the man you were before you joined this war? Dmitry hesitates, his hands trembling slightly. No, he admits, his voice barely audible. I don't know who I am anymore. Every time I think about what I've done, what I've been part of, it feels like I'm drowning. The interviewer's gaze doesn't waver. That's the weight of your choices, Dmitry. It's not just the people you hurt. It's what you've done to yourself. You can't go back to who you were because that man doesn't exist anymore. Dmitry's eyes glisten, but no tears fall. He takes a deep, shaky breath, his voice breaking as he speaks. I didn't want this, he whispers. I wanted to do something good to make a difference. But now, I don't even know if that was ever real. The moral weight of Dmitry's choices has left deep scars on his psyche, carving away at the identity he once clung to. The justifications he built for himself crumble under the weight of the lives he affected, the destruction he enabled. The man who marched into war believing he was a protector now struggles to reconcile that image with the reality of his actions. Dmitry's mind is a battlefield of its own, haunted by the faces of the innocent, the cries he ignored, and the silence that became his complicity. Each memory is a reminder that the choices he made, however small they seemed at the time, shaped not only the lives of others, but also the man he has become. And as the interviewer's words settle over him, Dmitry is left with a truth he cannot escape. The moral weight of his actions is one he will carry for the rest of his life. Dmitry Nikolayevich's final mission was supposed to be routine, or so he thought. The orders came down from his commanders with little explanation, just another operation to secure control over a small Ukrainian village near the front lines. Dmitry, like the others in his unit, didn't question it. They had been told time and again that their presence was vital, that each village they entered was a step towards stabilizing the region. This time, the target was a village near the Seversky Donets River, a strategic location for both sides. Dmitry's battalion was tasked with securing the area and rooting out what they were told were saboteurs, a catch-all term used to justify almost any action. The operation began under the cover of darkness. Dmitry was assigned to the rear, guarding the makeshift command post while the more seasoned fighters swept the village. He remembers the sound of distant gunfire, the occasional burst of shouting, but for the most part, his part of the mission felt eerily quiet. Until it wasn't. The first explosion shook the ground, the shockwave throwing Dmitry off balance. His radio crackled with frantic voices, but the orders were unclear. Fall back, someone shouted, but by then it was too late. Ukrainian forces lying in wait had ambushed the battalion. Dmitry recalls the chaos vividly, the sharp staccato of gunfire, the blinding flashes of grenades exploding in the distance, the cries of injured comrades. He froze for a moment, clutching his rifle, unsure whether to stand his ground or run. Before he could decide, a second explosion tore through their position, scattering his unit and leaving Dmitry disoriented. In the confusion, he stumbled into the woods, his instincts driving him toward cover. He thought he could regroup, find his way back to his comrades, but instead, he found himself alone, lost in unfamiliar terrain. Hours passed as he wandered, his mind racing with fear and exhaustion. He could hear the occasional sound of gunfire in the distance, but it grew fainter as time went on. Dmitry's survival instincts told him to keep moving, but hunger and fatigue began to take their toll. Just as dawn broke, Dmitry emerged from the trees into a clearing, and straight into the sights of Ukrainian soldiers. He dropped his weapon immediately, his hands raised in surrender. He didn't resist as they bound his hands and led him away, his mind numb with shock. Captured and surrounded, Dmitry's thoughts were a tangle of fear and disbelief. His final mission, the one that was supposed to be routine, had brought him here, to a cold, unforgiving reality he could no longer escape. For the first time, Dmitry was forced to confront the war not as a soldier, but as a prisoner, stripped of his weapon, his comrades, and the carefully constructed narrative he had used to justify his actions. This was the end of his role in the conflict, but the beginning of a reckoning he was wholly unprepared for. As he sat in silence, waiting for what came next, the weight of the war, and his place in it, settled over him like a shadow he could never escape. Dmitry Nikolayevich's first moments with his Ukrainian captors were a blur of fear and uncertainty. Hands bound tightly behind his back, he was pushed into the back of a military vehicle, his captors silent except for clipped instructions exchanged in Ukrainian. He kept his eyes down, his mind racing with possibilities. None of them good. The journey to the detention facility felt endless, the silence only broken by the occasional burst of static from the soldiers' radios. When they arrived, Dmitry was escorted into a dimly lit room, his legs heavy with exhaustion and dread. He was seated at a metal table, flanked by 2 guards who stood stone-faced at either side. Across from him, a man in civilian clothes entered the room, a Ukrainian officer, clipboard in hand. The officer sat down and fixed Dmitry with a cold, appraising stare. "You're with the Przyrek battalion," the officer said flatly, more a statement than a question. Dmitry hesitated and nodded slightly. "Yes," he replied quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He wanted to explain, to offer his version of the story, but the officer raised a hand to silence him. "Save your excuses, Dmitry. We've heard them all before. Now, tell me, why are you here? What brought you to this war?" Dmitry shifted in his seat, his bound hands making him feel exposed and vulnerable. I thought I was helping," he stammered. "Helping the people in Donbass, protecting them from Kiev's forces." The officer's eyebrows rose slightly, his expression a mixture of disbelief and restrained anger. Protecting them? From whom? Their own country? Or maybe from the men in your battalion who looted their homes and tore apart their families? Dmitry flinched at the words, but he clung to his story. "I didn't do those things," he said quickly. "I was just following orders. I didn't have a choice." The officer leaned forward, his voice cold and measured. "Following orders doesn't erase the harm you caused. You came here with a gun in your hand. You marched into villages that weren't yours. You claim you didn't have a choice, but did the people in those villages? Did the families who lost their homes?" Dmitry looked down, unable to meet the officer's piercing gaze. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he murmured. "I just wanted to do something good, to make a difference." The officer's response was sharp. "And do you think you made a difference, Dmitry? Because the people we've spoken to, the ones who lived through what your battalion did, they don't remember you as a hero. They remember fear. They remember destruction. Is that the difference you wanted to make?" Dmitry's silence was deafening. The officer continued, his voice unrelenting. "We spoke to a woman from Svitlodarsk. She remembers your unit taking her husband in the middle of the night. He never came back. She says her children cry themselves to sleep, asking where their father is." "What do you say to her, Dmitry?" I don't know her," Dmitry said weakly, his voice breaking. "I didn't take anyone. I didn't." "But you were there, Dmitry." The officer's voice grew colder, the weight of his words crushing. "You stood by while it happened. You let it happen. How do you explain that?" Dmitry's lips trembled, but no words came. His carefully constructed narrative of being a reluctant soldier, a protector, was unraveling with each pointed question. For every claim of innocence he offered, the officer countered with the voices of the victims, voices that Dmitry could no longer ignore. By the end of the session, Dmitry sat slumped in his chair, his spirit battered by the weight of the truths he had tried to evade. His Ukrainian captors didn't need to shout or resort to cruelty to break him. They simply held up a mirror, forcing him to confront the reality of his actions. And in that reflection, Dmitry saw not the hero he imagined himself to be, but the shadow of a man complicit in unimaginable harm. Dmitry Nikolayevich's composure, already fragile, begins to splinter under the relentless scrutiny of the interview. Each question from his captors chips away at the narrative he has desperately tried to maintain. At first, he clings to the same defenses he has repeated since his capture. "I didn't hurt anyone. I followed orders. I was only there to help." But as the interrogation deepens, his responses become inconsistent, his voice trembling with frustration and doubt. "You say you were there to protect the people of Donbass," the interviewer presses, their tone sharp and unwavering. "But why then? Do they remember you as an invader?" Dmitry hesitates, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for an answer that won't come. "I don't know," he says finally, his voice cracking. Maybe they didn't understand why we were there." The interviewer doesn't let up. "And did you?" Dmitry's hands tremble slightly as he grips the edge of the table, his knuckles white. I thought I did, he mutters, his gaze fixed on the floor. I believed in what they told us, that we were liberating people. But the words trail off, his silence louder than any confession. But what, Dmitry? The interviewer prompts, leaning forward. Dmitry's shoulders sag as the weight of the question presses down on him. I don't know anymore, he admits, his voice barely above a whisper. The interviewer seizes the opening. You don't know, or you don't want to know. You talk about following orders. But what about the orders you didn't question? The things you saw and did nothing to stop. Dmitry's head snaps up, his voice rising defensively. I didn't have a choice, he exclaims, his tone edged with desperation. If I had resisted, if I had said anything, I would have been the one shot. The interviewer's reply is calm, but cutting. And what about the people who had no choice, Dmitry? The families who lost their homes, their loved ones. Did they have any say in what happened to them? Dmitry exhales sharply, his composure slipping further. I didn't want any of this, he says, his voice breaking. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I thought I was doing the right thing. And yet, here you are, the interviewer counters, their words striking like a hammer. And here they are, the people whose lives will never be the same because of your choices. Dmitry's face crumples, his carefully maintained mask shattering completely. His voice quivers as he speaks, tears welling in his eyes. I didn't know it would be like this, he says, almost pleading. I thought I was helping. I thought I was doing something good. But his voice cracks, and he presses his hands against his face, as though trying to hide from the truth. The interviewer allows a moment of silence to stretch between them before speaking again, their tone quieter but no less firm. The truth, Dmitry, is that you convinced yourself you were helping because it was easier than facing what you were actually doing. And now you can't run from it anymore. Dmitry lets out a choked sob, his tears falling freely now. I didn't want this, he whispers through his hands. I didn't want any of this. But his words, no matter how raw, can't undo the damage of his actions, or the contradictions that have finally caught up with him. Dmitry Nikolayevich sits slumped in his chair, his face pale and streaked with the remnants of his earlier breakdown. The weight of the stories shared by his captors and the contradictions in his testimony have left him visibly shaken. Still, he tries to piece together some form of justification, clinging to fragments of his belief system to make sense of what he has done. I thought I was doing the right thing, he begins, his voice weak but steadying as he speaks. I believed in the cause, in protecting the people of Donbass from the chaos. That's what they told us, what they drilled into us every day. I wasn't there to hurt anyone. I wanted to help, to protect. His words sound rehearsed, like a mantra he's repeated to himself countless times, but they carry a hollowness that even Dmitry seems to recognize now. The interviewer leans forward, their tone measured but pointed. And do you still believe that, Dmitry? After everything you've seen, everything you've heard from the people who lived through what your battalion did? Dmitry hesitates, his hands clasping and unclasping as if searching for something solid to hold on to. I don't know anymore, he admits, his voice faltering. I thought I was helping, but maybe we weren't. The interviewer presses further. When you saw families running from their homes, when you heard the cries of children hiding in basements, did you ever stop to think if what you were doing was right? Dmitry looks down, his jaw tightening. At the time, I told myself it was necessary, that it was all part of the mission. But now, he trails off, his voice trembling. Now I see their faces every time I close my eyes. The boy chasing after the truck, the woman crying for her husband. I tell myself it wasn't my fault, that I didn't do those things, but it doesn't help. The interviewer nods slightly, their gaze steady. And why doesn't it help, Dmitry? Because you know you were part of it, whether you pulled the trigger or not. Dmitry's shoulders slump further, his voice a whisper now. I was there. I didn't stop it. I didn't even try. The words hang heavy in the air, a quiet admission that cuts deeper than any accusation. The interviewer gives him a moment before continuing. You talk about protecting people, about helping, but the people you claim to have helped remember fear, not safety. How do you reconcile that with the beliefs you still hold? Dmitry's head shakes slowly, his eyes glistening. I don't know, he murmurs. I tell myself I didn't have a choice, that I was following orders, but it feels empty, like an excuse. Maybe I could have done something. Maybe I should have. He pauses, taking a deep breath as he struggles to find the words. I wanted to believe we were doing the right thing, that we were fighting for something bigger than ourselves. But now I don't even know what that was. The interviewer's tone softens, but their words remain firm. The beliefs you held brought you here, Dmitry. To this war, to this room, to the guilt you can't escape. Do you still believe in those ideals, or have you finally started to see the truth? Dmitry's hands tremble slightly as he wipes his face. I don't know, he says again, his voice cracking. I don't know what to believe anymore. The cause, the mission, it all feels like a lie now. But if it was a lie, then what does that make me? The room falls silent for a moment, the weight of Dmitry's question hanging between them. He looks up, his expression one of anguish and uncertainty. I wanted to be someone who made a difference, someone who did something good. But now I feel like all I've done is make things worse. How do I live with that? The interviewer doesn't answer immediately, allowing Dmitry's words to settle. When they speak, their tone is quiet but unyielding. That's something only you can answer, Dmitry. But the first step is facing the truth, not just about what you've done, but about the beliefs that brought you here. Dmitry nods faintly, his gaze distant. The ideals he once clung to now feel hollow, their weight replaced by the unbearable reality of his actions. In his attempt to reconcile his beliefs with the harm he caused, Dmitry is left with more questions than answers. The certainty he once held shattered beyond repair. The interviewer leans back slightly, their expression unreadable as Dmitry Nikolayevich's faltering admissions hang in the air. For all his attempts to explain himself, to reconcile his actions with the beliefs he once held, his words feel fragmented, incomplete. The interviewer lets the silence stretch just long enough for the discomfort to settle before speaking. Dmitry, you say you believed in the cause, that you were there to protect people, but your actions and the realities of what happened don't align with those beliefs. Do you see the contradiction? Dmitry nods faintly, his voice hesitant. I see it now, yes. I didn't want to cause harm. I thought I was helping, but His voice trails off, and the interviewer seizes the moment. You thought you were helping. But helping whom? Dmitry. The people whose homes were taken. The families who fled. Or were you helping yourself to survive, to avoid questioning orders, to escape responsibility? Dmitry flinches at the directness of the question, his hands gripping the edge of the table. I didn't think about it like that at the time, he admits quietly. I told myself I was doing my duty. The interviewer's tone sharpens. Your duty? Was it your duty to stand by while your battalion raided homes? To stay silent while families were torn apart? You claim you didn't pull the trigger, but does that make you innocent? Dmitry opens his mouth to respond, but falters, his silence betraying his internal conflict. The interviewer presses further, their voice steady but relentless. You say you regret what happened, that you didn't know it would be like this. But isn't it convenient, Dmitry, to regret it now when it's too late to change anything? Where was that doubt when you were following orders, when you were carrying a rifle into villages that weren't yours? Dmitry's expression crumples, his voice trembling. I didn't know how to stop it, he murmurs. I didn't have the power to stop it. The interviewer's gaze narrows. Didn't have the power or didn't want the risk? You talk about not having a choice, but every day you chose to stay. You chose to keep following orders. Was that really about duty, Dmitry? Or was it about protecting yourself? Dmitry leans back, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the question. His voice breaks as he tries to respond. I didn't know what else to do. I was scared. I just wanted to survive. The interviewer's voice softens slightly, but the edge remains. Survival is a powerful instinct, Dmitry. But survival at what cost? The people in those villages didn't have a choice. They couldn't just walk away. But you made a choice every day to stay, to ignore what you saw, to keep moving forward. Dmitry's hands tremble as he wipes at his face, his voice barely audible. I didn't want to think about it, he admits. If I thought too much, I couldn't handle it. The interviewer leans forward, their tone now quieter but no less piercing. And that's the gap, Dmitry. You're trying to reconcile your actions with your beliefs, but you refuse to confront the truth. You say you wanted to protect people, but your silence protected only yourself. You claim to regret what happened, but you didn't regret it until you were here, forced to face the consequences. Do you understand what that means? Dmitry's gaze drops to the table, his expression one of anguish and exhaustion. I think so, he says weakly. But how do I make it right? The interviewer's response is cold but clear. You can't make it right, Dmitry. You can only stop lying to yourself. Stop pretending you were the hero in this story. Accept the harm you caused, the lives you changed forever. Until you do that, you'll never truly understand the weight of what you've done. Dmitry nods faintly. his silence an acknowledgement of the gaps in his own reflections, the beliefs he clung to, the justifications he used to shield himself. They crumble under the harsh light of the truth. And as the interviewer's words settle over him, Dmitry is left to grapple with the undeniable reality. The man he thought he was, and the man he became, are irreconcilably different. The room falls into an uneasy silence as Dmitry Nikolayevich stares down at the table, his hands trembling slightly. The interviewer's words linger, a relentless echo in his mind. After a long pause, the interviewer speaks again, their tone calm but probing, the questions deliberate and cutting. Dmitry, do you think you deserve redemption? The question hangs in the air, its weight pressing down on him. Dmitry hesitates, his voice cracking as he responds. I don't know, he murmurs. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. But the interviewer isn't satisfied. Not meaning for something to happen doesn't erase the fact that it did. The families you displaced, the lives your battalion destroyed, they live with the consequences of your actions every day. How do you begin to make amends for that? Dmitry's gaze remains fixed on the table, his hands clasped tightly together. I don't know if I can, he whispers. I don't even know where to start. The interviewer leans forward slightly, their voice steady. Redemption isn't about erasing what you've done, Dmitry. It's about accepting it, owning it. Are you ready to do that? To stop hiding behind excuses and face the full truth of your role in this war? Dmitry exhales shakily, his voice trembling as he replies. I don't know if I have the strength. Every time I think about it, it feels like too much. Like too much. Like it's swallowing me whole. The interviewer's gaze sharpens. And what about the people whose lives were swallowed whole by your battalion's actions? The families who lost their homes, their fathers, their children? If you can't face your own guilt, what does that say about how much you truly regret what happened? Dmitry's face contorts, a mixture of anguish and desperation. I do regret it, he says emphatically. Every day I regret it. But what good does that do now? I can't go back. I can't change what happened. The interviewer's voice softens slightly, but their words cut just as deeply. Regret is a start, Dmitry. But it's not enough. The question is, what are you willing to do about it? Will you tell the truth, even if it incriminates you? Will you admit your role, even if it means losing the last shred of the image you've built for yourself? Dmitry hesitates, his lips trembling. I don't know, he says again, his voice cracking. I want to, but I don't know if I can. The interviewer lets the silence stretch for a moment before speaking again. Dmitry, if you can't hold yourself accountable, how can you ever hope to ask for forgiveness? Do you believe you owe the people you hurt, directly or indirectly, more than just your regret? Dmitry's eyes glisten as he looks up, meeting the interviewer's gaze for the first time in what feels like hours. I do, he whispers. I owe them everything. But I don't know if they'll ever forgive me. The interviewer's tone becomes even more deliberate. Forgiveness isn't something you can demand or expect. It's something you have to earn, piece by piece. Are you willing to spend the rest of your life working toward that, knowing you might never receive it? Dmitry's breath catches, his hands tightening into fists. I don't know if I can live with that, he admits, his voice breaking. But maybe I deserve it. The interviewer's final question lands with the weight of a hammer. What do you think accountability means, Dmitry? Is it enough to feel guilty, or does it require more? What are you prepared to sacrifice to prove that your regret isn't just words? Dmitry doesn't respond immediately, his silence speaking volumes. The questions hover in the air, unanswered but unavoidable. As the seconds tick by, the depth of his inner turmoil is evident. These questions are not meant to comfort him, but to confront him with the stark reality of his situation. Redemption, if it is possible, will not come easily, and accountability demands far more than he has given so far. Whether he is capable of facing that reality remains to be seen. Dmitry Nikolayevich is just one man, but his story is emblematic of a larger machine, a propaganda apparatus that has shaped thousands, perhaps millions of lives in Russia. This machine does not merely inform, it molds perceptions, stokes fears, and creates a version of reality that serves those in power. Dmitry grew up in a world where the lines between truth and fiction were blurred, where state narratives were repeated until they became indistinguishable from fact. His belief that he was protecting the people of Donbass was not born from personal conviction, but from the constant repetition of a carefully curated story. From state-controlled television to online platforms filled with misinformation, Dmitry was inundated with messages of a failing Ukraine, overrun by extremists, manipulated by Western powers. These stories painted a picture of chaos just beyond Russia's borders, a threat that only a strong, decisive Russia could counter. In this narrative, Dmitry and others like him were cast as heroes before they ever picked up a rifle. They were the saviors of Russian-speaking people, defenders of a legacy that stretched back to the Soviet Union. This identity, cultivated by years of propaganda, gave Dmitry purpose, a cause he believed was worth fighting for. But the propaganda machine doesn't just create heroes, it creates enemies. For individuals like Dmitry, Ukrainians were not neighbors or people seeking self-determination. They were portrayed as pawns of the West, aggressors undermining regional stability. This dehumanization made it easier for Dmitry to justify his actions, or his silence. He wasn't looting homes or standing by as families were torn apart. He was protecting people from an existential threat. The propaganda provided a moral framework that allowed individuals to participate in atrocities without confronting the weight of their actions. The machine's effectiveness lies in its simplicity and repetition. By reducing complex geopolitical issues to black and white narratives, it offers a comforting clarity to individuals like Dmitry. There's no need to question orders or reflect on the morality of one's actions when the narrative has already provided the answers. Dmitry's battalion wasn't invading, it was liberating. The people fleeing their homes weren't victims of his comrades. They were victims of the chaos his battalion had come to suppress. These falsehoods were not just part of Dmitry's worldview, they were the foundation of it. The consequences of this propaganda reach far beyond Dmitry himself. It creates a collective mindset where questioning the narrative is seen as betrayal, where silence becomes complicity, and where entire communities are drawn into a cycle of violence and justification. Dmitry's story is not unique. It is a reflection of a system designed to perpetuate itself by turning ordinary individuals into instruments of its agenda. And yet, the cracks in the propaganda machine become evident when individuals like Dmitry are forced to confront the reality outside its narrative, the testimonies of survivors, the undeniable evidence of destruction. And the quiet moments of reflection reveal the gaps between what Dmitry was told and what he experienced. These moments of dissonance are the first steps in unraveling the hold of propaganda, but they come too late for those already caught in its grip. Dmitry's story highlights a harsh truth. The propaganda machine doesn't just obscure reality, it replaces it. For people like him, breaking free from its grasp is not just a matter of seeing the truth, it is a matter of unlearning the lies that have shaped their identity. And for every Dmitry who begins to question, there are countless others who will never have the chance, their lives consumed by the machine's relentless churn. The cost of this system is paid in shattered lives, broken communities, and the enduring scars of a war built on deception. Dmitry Nikolayevich's story is not just about one man's journey through war. It is a reflection of the larger issues of moral accountability and the dangers of manipulation. As his narrative unravels, it becomes clear that the choices he made were not entirely his own. They were shaped by a system that taught him what to believe, who to fear, and how to justify his actions. Yet, even within this system, Dmitry made decisions to stay silent, to follow orders, to avoid questioning what he was told. His story serves as a reminder that while external forces can influence us, the ultimate responsibility for our actions lies within ourselves. For viewers, the lesson is stark. Accountability is not something that begins when the consequences of our actions catch up to us. It begins with the choices we make in the moment. Dmitry's inability to question the narrative he was fed led him down a path where his silence and inaction caused harm to others. His regret, however deep, cannot erase the pain inflicted on those who crossed his path. This raises an essential question for all of us. How often do we accept what we are told without questioning its truth? How often do we allow convenience or fear to dictate our actions? Dmitry's story also underscores the insidious power of manipulation. The propaganda that shaped his beliefs was not accidental. It was deliberate, designed to create soldiers who would act without hesitation and justify their actions without reflection. This manipulation didn't just target Dmitry, it targets anyone susceptible to simplified narratives that divide the world into heroes and enemies. To resist such manipulation, we must cultivate a critical mind, one that seeks out multiple perspectives and questions easy answers. This is not just a lesson for those in conflict zones, it is a lesson for everyone living in an age where information is weaponized. The consequences of failing to resist manipulation are evident in Dmitry's story. Lives destroyed, communities torn apart, and individuals left grappling with guilt and loss. Finally, Dmitry's journey reveals the heavy burden of moral accountability. It is not enough to feel regret or acknowledge mistakes after the fact. True accountability requires facing the full weight of one's actions, admitting complicity, and working to make amends, even when redemption feels out of reach. Dmitry's struggle to reconcile his beliefs with his actions shows that accountability is a painful but necessary process, one that demands honesty, courage, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. For viewers, the challenge is clear. We must hold ourselves accountable for the choices we make and the narratives we accept. Dmitry's story is a cautionary tale, but it is also an opportunity, a chance to reflect on our own lives, question the systems we operate within, and ensure that we do not become silent participants in harm. In the end, the lessons of Dmitry's story are not just for him, they are for all of us.